Is Russia's unilaterally declared ceasefire being violated by Moscow? Ukraine says so, claiming bombs were dropped just hours after the three-day pause officially went into effect. After more than 20 ceasefires have failed, will any pause in fighting bring us closer to ending the war? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the ceasefire in Ukraine. As Russia honors the anniversary of its victory in World War II, Moscow said it would also honor a three-day ceasefire in Ukraine. It went into effect at midnight on Thursday, but within hours, Kyiv says it was violated. Ukraine actually never agreed to it and has consistently argued, along with the United States, for a 30-day ceasefire and negotiations. But Russia wasn't interested, prompting the Trump administration to say Russia is asking too much. Here's a look.
For Russia, May the 9th is more than a holiday. It's a reminder of past glory. To mark the 80th anniversary of victory in Europe, President Vladimir Putin has declared a three-day ceasefire in Ukraine. Yet just hours before the truce was to begin, Russian airstrikes ripped through northern Ukraine. The promise of peace felt hollow from the first blast.
Ukraine's proposal to cease strikes and establish at least a 30-day ceasefire remains in force, but from Russia, the world sees no response, except for new strikes. This clearly demonstrates to everyone who the source of the war is.
In Moscow, Putin hosted Xi Jinping in lavish Victory Day ceremonies, underscoring their so-called no-limits partnership.
At present, in the face of the international counter-current of unilateralism and hegemonic bullying behavior, China will work with Russia to shoulder the special responsibilities of being major world powers and jointly promote the correct view of World War II history.
Meanwhile, the US is losing patience in mediation efforts. On Wednesday, Vice President J.D. Vance said that Russia is asking too much in the negotiations, adding that direct talks between the two sides are necessary to end the war.
And there's a big gulf, predictably, between where the Russians and the Ukrainians are, and we think the next step in the negotiation is to try to close that gulf. We think it's probably impossible for us to mediate this entirely without at least some direct negotiation between the two.
As Russia leans into its history to justify its actions, the war continues to stretch its reach. But Xi Jinping's visit highlights the deepening ties between Russia and its allies, showing the world that this isn't just about Ukraine anymore. It's about a much bigger global struggle.
I think that the participation by North Korea and China is important because it shows that Russia is escalating this conflict by bringing in out-of-region countries.
May the 10th is approaching. And as the end of the ceasefire nears, Ukraine is still waiting. Will the guns fall silent at last? Or will this ceasefire be just another fleeting promise?
Now, very few, if any, believe this three-day ceasefire will mark the beginning of serious negotiations. So where does the peace process really stand? Joining me now to debate that and more are from New York, Director of Communications for the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, Andrei Drobyansky. From Moscow, former Russian diplomat Vyacheslav Matusov, and from London, Central Asia Fellow in the Eurasia Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Maximilian Hess. Thanks all so much for being with me. Andrei, I'll start with you because first I think we need to clarify what this three-day ceasefire really amounts to. If Ukraine says Russia unilaterally declared it, only to break it a few hours later.
I think you nailed it. We've been down this road most recently during Easter, when unfortunately numerous civilians were killed all over Ukraine during a proposed ceasefire by Russia, which isn't an actual ceasefire. At that time, Ukraine responded in the same way that it did to this proposed ceasefire, that it is ready to put in an unconditional 30-day ceasefire whenever Russia is ready. This is something that President Trump proposed back on March 11th, and we are still that is several thousand ballistic missiles and Shahed drones ago that have been launched at Ukraine when a potential ceasefire could have happened. So the ball is really in the court of Russia if it wants to demonstrate to the rest of the world that it is into peace, or we can see how Ukraine has been acting, not only willing to work, willing to do a 30-day ceasefire like the Americans have asked for, but also working in concert with numerous other countries working towards a peace.
Okay, so Vyacheslav, do give us the view then from Moscow. I mean, did Russia actually break the very ceasefire that it unilaterally declared?
The ceasefire this time was suggested by Russia, so it is not Russia who is responsible for the ceasefire, because Russia proclaimed that from 007 of May it begins, and that till 11 the end of the day. I don't see any problems with Russian position. Russia suggested this ceasefire, but this ceasefire for 3 days was rejected by Zelensky, president of Ukraine. And so if he rejected ceasefire for 3 days and demanding ceasefire for 30 days, not less, that means that the problem of ceasefire not on the ball on the Russian side, but on the Ukrainian side. Where is his approval of this ceasefire? I don't see it in the theoretically isn't.
Okay.
Logically speaking, I can say that it is for Russia to today 4 p.m. That begins the ceasefire on the village, the name Tetyokino, where Russia was making some ceasefire, some fire shots, because it was a concentration of Ukrainian forces and efforts by their groups to enter Tetyokino village. Half of village on the side of Russia, half of village on the side of Ukrainian.
Understood.
It is Russian territory.
Okay, let me just, I'm going to move on to Maximilian quickly, because apparently you don't have to enforce a ceasefire even if you unilaterally declare it if the other side doesn't agree. So the 3-day ceasefire we've been talking about, in Russia's mind, apparently never really existed. So let's talk about the 30-day unconditional ceasefire that Ukraine has been pushing for, along with the United States, to be fair. Moscow hasn't wanted that. What do you think, I guess I can say Moscow is afraid of? Why wouldn't Moscow accept? If they're willing to accept 3 days, why not 30?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to this conversation. You know, the real tragedy is the reason why Moscow wants this ceasefire is simply because tomorrow is Victory Day, as it is celebrated in Russia. Today is Victory in Europe Day, as it is celebrated in Europe and the United States, marking the end of the Second World War. And Vladimir Putin, as he typically does, in a tradition that he revived when he first returned to the presidency, or when he first became president 25 years ago, of holding these large military parades in Moscow. Putin wants to avoid the embarrassment of Ukrainian drone strikes during that time. We saw just yesterday at least 2 drones, likely launched from Ukraine, targeted Russian military installations outside Moscow and in Tula Oblast. But really that this comes on this most symbolic and most important of anniversaries, the 80th anniversary of the war, really speaks to what a tragedy this is, and that Vladimir Putin is spitting on the graves of both those Russians and Ukrainians who died fighting against fascism in some of these very same territories that Russia is attacking right now. So Putin wants to be able to claim that image and portray strength at home on this Victory Day at the same time that he is undermining the very simple thing that it stood for, which was peace in Europe and the ending of the threat of fascism that Russia's forces now present on Ukrainian territory today, where Nazi forces presented it over 80 years ago.
Okay. Let me come back to Andrei then. I mean, it's interesting to hear again a parallel between World War II and the conditions today, because as we know, I mean, it was a headline, so I'll bring this up. former President Joe Biden did, an interview that was widely broadcast, saying specifically, probably most disturbing to how the United States is currently handling this conflict is that Trump, he says, is appeasing Putin. How do you see that? Is this the case? Is it the same as we knew appeasing to be during World War II?
Well, appeasing with rhetoric, for sure. We have seen that from the very first day, even before his inauguration, much language directed towards agreeing with the Russian position. However, I think we've seen from the Trump administration very rapidly since the beginning of these so-called peace proposals from Donald Trump is that the Russian side does not want to play ball with the American proposal. We saw an enormous amount of sticks against Ukraine. It would not be the way Ukraine proposed to do a ceasefire. It had to be the way that President Trump wanted a ceasefire. Ukraine acceded to this after President Trump stopped military shipments to Ukraine, after President Trump stopped sharing satellite imagery with Ukraine. But Ukraine agreed to this. On the other side, we have not seen sticks against the Russian Federation. We have seen an enormous amount of appeals. And most embarrassingly for President Trump, was the fact that he had a well-publicized in advance phone call in March with President Putin, after which he had scheduled a press conference to announce to the world that he was on the path to peace. And not a single time since the beginning of that phone call onward has there been any hope that President Trump would have the ability to have a press conference that he has discovered peace. And he has discovered that since talking to Putin, that the Russian side isn't willing to do what he would like them to do, as opposed to the Ukrainian side. So if you take this back to World War II in your original question, sometimes there were nations that needed to be prodded along to understand what the fight is for real. And one of those nations was America, because as we all know, World War II started in 1939, and the invasion of Poland and Ukrainian territories, a joint invasion by the Soviet army that Putin glorifies so well. And it is that memory that needs to be reminded, that it took several years for the United States to finally shed itself of its isolationism and really support the cause going forward.
Okay. Vyacheslav, I would like your opinion on really the same question, though. Would you accept that currently President Trump is doing the equivalent of appeasement, as we saw in the past, and arguably why Russia ended up having to fight so much longer from the Russian perspective in World War II, because another leader, in this case your president, is being appeased?
Well, first of all, we are not against our agreement with Donald Trump as the President of the United States. It's a very clear position of Russian Federation from all levels, from people level to the leadership. So, but the problem of Donald Trump is the internal problem of the United States, and the internal problem on Western coalition, because we knew that quite a lot of rejection of his points from the European countries, from the European Union, from NATO organization, from Great Britain, and inside the United States. Democratic Party, Joe Biden take some position contradicting the decision of Donald Trump. We are not, we understand very clearly the situation surrounding Donald Trump and his opportunity and possibility to intervene in Russian-Ukrainian situation. Okay. So I think that we have bad experience, a good memory and bad experience. Minsk's agreement, when we with Americans agreed 24% in Finland, in Boisto, the island of Boisto in Finland, where it met in 215 commands from the United States, green, the chief of Kissinger Foundation, Andrew Weiss as a vice president of also Rand Corporation, and from Russian side the different people, and they agreed on 24. And with 8 years,
and again, you feel
we
it wasn't...
are watching how European leadership were solving Ukrainian and fulfilling Ukrainian issue. How they said.
You feel Russia wasn't respected then?
Angela Merkel said very clearly.
Okay, I'll tell you what, though, let's move on to, if you don't mind. We're limited for time, so we do have to move on, give everyone equal time to speak if possible. Maximilian, I'll ask you this because you brought up, the specifics, really, of celebrating Victory Day at this current time. And in attendance, we have to point out, in the celebrations in Moscow, are major world leaders, including the presidents of China and Brazil. India was also going to attend, by the way, but because of the tensions with Pakistan, declined in the end. Now we're seeing a lot of pro-Ukrainians will call this a re-legitimization of President Putin, and that it is now showing that it's just a matter of time before he is fully accepted into the wider global community again. Do you see that here because of the photo ops we're witnessing now out of Moscow at present?
Certainly. President Putin is a very thin-skinned individual. And those presidents and leaders of other states who are in attendance are there because they recognize that he has a lot of sensitivities and lashes out in quite egregious manners when he gets angry. Russian hackers, Russian economic warfare are things that the Kremlin has used far beyond just Ukrainian borders. For leaders like Xi Jinping in particular, the costs of attending are relatively low. And of course, Xi has his own issues with the West and wants to be seen to be strong and standing up against them at the time. But in reality, if you look at what Putin actually wants from Xi, he hasn't had it delivered to him. And that's three key things, right? Putin has sought to have Chinese direct military aid, has only had very limited amounts. He sought to have a deal with China on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline to replace the gas routes to Europe that he himself destroyed. And thirdly, he sought to have China intermediate Russian financial dealings with the rest of the world. More than 3 years into this conflict, he hasn't seen that same thing. Now, with Trump and his own rhetoric towards Putin, however, we see something very similar, which is that Trump might see somebody in Putin who he really wants to govern like. He's also a very thin-skinned individual. But Trump and Putin, if you look at their interests in the Ukrainian conflict, they're directly opposed to one another. So let's say Trump wants to control the Arctic routes of the future. That's why he cares about Greenland. Trump wants to sell more LNG, and tragically, Trump, with his minerals deal, wants to loot Ukraine for its natural resources. Vladimir Putin wants to sell more LNG. He wants to control the Arctic routes of the future, and he wants to loot, rape, and pillage Ukraine for all of its resources. So whether one likes these individuals or not, they're essentially the captains of two rival football teams. They might like each other's style and way of doing things, but they're not going to come around and agree some deal.
Okay, Andre, I have to ask you, I mean, specifically about what Maximilian just alluded to, and this is that the fact that Ukraine's parliament just ratified this mineral deal with the U.S., whether it's looting or not, this deal is going through now. And meanwhile, J.D. Vance also said that, Russia is asking too much, which is a real change in tone from the way we saw J.D. Vance in particular treat Ukraine when President Zelensky was at the White House. So how much has really changed then with Trump and Zelensky after that, specifically that Vatican meeting in which Trump actually started threatening Russia with secondary sanctions alongside, again, J.D. Vance finally saying, no, Russia, you're asking too much?
Well, with J.D. Vance, we know that he is not an ideologue. He jumps around from position to position, so it's not really a shock that he would go 180 degrees from one position with Russia to another.
But he represents the Trump administration.
He does, but again, he doesn't set the policy. And what you see on the screen is that historic meeting without Vance, without the cadre of the gentlemen in the White House who tend to egg on President Trump with his campaign-style rhetoric. When it's just him alone with another leader, we know that he's very good at getting along with other world leaders. And it was truly a historic moment at Pope Francis' funeral, where they got to express to each other in real terms without any distractions. It was exactly what President Zelensky wanted to do in the Oval Office. He had an entire folder of pictures of the injured civilians, women, children. That's what he wanted to focus on. But you see Vance on the screen jump into the conversation, and it destroyed the entire flow. So I think if we have more of those kind of conversations, it's better for the world in terms of strengthening alliances, not yelling at each other, not making everything into a big scene. And and you did mention the minerals deal. It is a historic deal that was just in the last hour ratified by Parliament on a unanimous vote in Ukraine. And the important part there is Ukraine has had good ties with the United States on the military to military track, on its diplomatic to diplomatic track, and even on in as far as its head prosecutor and attorney general. Would you call it
looting, though?
Would I call it looting? Nothing has happened yet. The important thing is there's an agreement on paper to further exercise both sides in terms of strengthening their partnership. In the end, we can see if you want to call it looting. But at this point, we just have a theoretical framework for how to eventually develop the natural resources of Ukraine.
Okay. Vyacheslav, let me come back to you, because just before this latest ceasefire, for whatever it's worth, you know, Ukrainian drones actually led to the shutdown of 4 Moscow airports, 9 others elsewhere. You know, Russians have been kind of able to witness most of this war from a rather comfortable position inside Russia, where they don't have to feel threatened. Do they fear that's changing now?
Well, I don't consider that it will be any changes in relations with Russia and Ukraine, because their differences are too big. I don't consider that these differences can be solved by the decision of President of the United States, Donald Trump. I don't consider it as possible for today. Reasons is because Russia demands not too much. Russia demands justice and equality in international relations. Equality, what we don't have. They consider that all our decisions should be dictated from the United States, from the Western partners of the nation, from European countries. No, it was not impossible. And main issue for this crisis that we are watching is the NATO plans for the spreading on behalf of Russian national interests, Russian national security. That was the reason why military actions began in Ukraine. It was split of interests of European countries and the United States and the NATO organization with Russian national interests. I think that the main conflict between Trump and Putin today is how to find a decision, a solution, to find this solution between American position, Western position, and Russian national interest.
Yeah,
they didn't find
it.
So,
I mean, that is...
any questions about ceasefire for 30 days,
we're still at this stalemate. Then
it is impossible.
We've only got 2 minutes left, so Maximilian, I'll let you wrap it up. I mean, will Russia and Ukraine, then, having heard especially Vyacheslav's last comments, will they ever sit down at the table together?
One day, I still believe in the Russian people's ability to drive historic change. And one day, Vladimir Putin will no longer be the president of that country. And these fundamental selling out of Russia's interests for his own personal interest will change. When that day comes, I believe that Russians will have a real reckoning with their history of not only the last 3 years, but the period since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. I truly believe that one day day Russians, just like many Germans today, will see the historic errors of their government's ways and will themselves come to the Ukrainians and ask for forgiveness. Whether the Ukrainians give that is entirely up to the Ukrainians and not to the rest of the world. But when that happens, yes, there will be peace, and I have full confidence that will happen one day. I just hope it's not as far in the future as it seems to be today.
But with you saying that, you fully admit that Trump's promise to end this conflict, not just on day one, but at least somewhere during his term, you don't see that coming?
I see that as extremely unlikely.
Okay. Maximilian, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of you, three of my panelists, really so much for being with us. Greatly appreciated. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.